Victoria Ashford believed that every tragedy in her life had begun in a blind spot, a moment unseen, a person unobserved, a truth hidden just beyond the edge of her vision. So she eliminated the darkness. Her estate in Greenwich, Connecticut had 47 cameras, microphones embedded in walls that cost more than most houses, motion sensors that tracked every footstep across marble floors. She was not afraid of thieves. She was afraid of people. The last time she trusted someone without evidence, she lost everything that mattered. So now her faith lived in data alone. Until the night a janitor walked through her door and never once looked up at the cameras watching him. His name was Darius Mitchell, and he came through a staffing agency that specialized in discretion. 41 years old, a black single dad, widower, father to a 9-year-old daughter named Amara. His background check was clean, his references were unremarkable, and his interview had lasted exactly 7 minutes because he answered every question with the minimum number of words required. Victoria had not conducted that interview, her household manager had, but she watched the recording afterward. The way she watched everything, and what struck her was not what Darius said, but what he did not do. He did not try to impress anyone. He did not ask about the estate or its owner. He did not make small talk or attempt to establish rapport. He simply stated his qualifications, confirmed his availability for the night shift, and waited in silence until he was dismissed. The agency had sent him to fill a gap in her staff. The previous night, a janitor had quit without notice, claiming the overnight hours were affecting his health. Victoria suspected the real reason was the cameras. Some people could not tolerate being watched. Darius Mitchell did not seem to notice them at all. His first shift began at 11 o'clock in the evening and ended at 7 in the morning. Victoria watched the first hour from her study on the second floor. The security feed displayed across 3 monitors that showed the main corridors, the kitchen, and the east wing. He moved through her house like a man who understood that every action carried weight. His mop strokes were deliberate, his footsteps were measured, he wore a gray uniform that the agency provided, and he kept his sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the chill that settled into the house after midnight. His forearms were warm brown under the harsh light, and his dark brown hands tightened around the mop handle with a steady, controlled grip. There was something almost meditative about the way he worked. No wasted motion, no distraction. He cleaned the marble floors of the main foyer with the same attention he gave to the utility closet near the garage. Every task received his full presence, as though the work itself deserved respect, regardless of whether anyone was watching, and yet there was urgency beneath the calm. Victoria noticed it first around 3 o'clock in the morning when Darius checked his watch for the 4th time in an hour. His pace quickened almost imperceptibly. His movements became more efficient, trimmed of any gesture that did not serve the task at hand. It was subtle enough that a casual observer would have missed it entirely. But Victoria was not a casual observer. She had spent 15 years in private equity before retiring at 43, and her fortune had been built on her ability to read the space between what people said and what they meant. Darius Mitchell was hiding something. Not in the obvious way, not with lies or misdirection, but in the way a man hides a wound he does not want anyone to see. He finished his shift 12 minutes early and left through the service entrance without speaking to anyone. The cameras tracked him to his car, a 12-year-old Honda Civic with a dent in the rear fender. He sat in the driver's seat for nearly a minute before starting the engine, his head bowed, his hands resting on the steering wheel. Victoria watched until his taillights disappeared down the long driveway, and then she rewound the footage and watched his entire shift again from the beginning. She told herself it was routine quality control, the same vigilance she applied to every aspect of her life. But somewhere beneath the justification, she knew the truth. Darius Mitchell had sparked something she had not felt in years. Curiosity. The second night, Victoria watched more closely. She noticed that Darius never touched anything he did not need to clean. In the library, where first editions worth hundreds of thousands of dollars sat on shelves without glass, he dusted only the surfaces and never once reached for a book. In the dining room, where a Tiffany chandelier hung above a table that could seat 20, he worked around the crystal without disturbing a single pendant. Most people, when they thought they were alone, allowed themselves small liberties. A glance through a private drawer, a moment of rest in an expensive chair, the temptation to touch beautiful things simply because they were there. Darius showed no such impulses. He moved through her house like a guest who understood he had been granted temporary passage and intended to honor the terms of his welcome. By the third night, Victoria had begun to track his patterns. He always started with the main foyer, then moved to the kitchen, then the first floor corridors. He took his break at 2:30, exactly 30 minutes, during which he sat in the staff break room and ate a sandwich he brought from home. He never used the coffee machine or the refrigerator that was stocked for household employees. His precision was extraordinary and deeply unsettling. Victoria had learned long ago that people who appeared too perfect were usually hiding the most. Transparency was messy. Authenticity had rough edges. The polished surface that Darius presented to her cameras suggested a man who had learned to control every visible aspect of himself. The question was why? On the fourth night, she began reviewing his footage in real time rather than waiting until morning. She sat in her study with a glass of wine that she barely touched, her attention fixed on the monitors as Darius made his way through the East Wing corridors. He was too careful. That was the phrase that kept returning to her mind. Too careful to be innocent, too careful to ignore. She watched him clean the windows of the solarium with the same meticulous attention he gave to everything else. Watched him empty the trash bins and replace the liners with crisp, efficient movements. Watched him pause outside the door to her private study where a small bronze sculpture sat on a pedestal in the hallway. He looked at it for nearly 10 seconds, a figure of a woman with her arms raised towards the sky. Then he continued past without touching it. Victoria rewound the footage and watched those 10 seconds again. There was something in his expression that the camera almost captured. Not covetousness, not calculation, something closer to recognition or perhaps remembrance. The sculpture had been a gift from her mother, one of the few things Victoria had kept after the funeral. She added it to her list of observations and told herself that patterns would eventually reveal the truth. Every person had a tell. Every secret left traces. All she had to do was watch long enough, and Darius Mitchell would show her who he really was. The fifth night brought the first deviation. Victoria was reviewing footage from the previous evening when she noticed something unusual in the East Wing corridor. At approximately 4 a.m, Darius had left his assigned area and walked to the far end of the hall where a portrait hung in a gilded frame. The portrait showed a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes. Margaret Ashford, Victoria's mother, painted 3 months before her death from complications following what should have been a routine surgery. The hospital had made errors, small ones that compounded into catastrophe, and afterward Victoria had learned that one of the surgical nurses had raised concerns about the procedure but had been dismissed by her superiors. The concerns were documented, the documentation was ignored, and Margaret Ashford had died because people in positions of authority had chosen to protect their processes rather than their patient. Victoria had sued. She had won. The settlement had been substantial enough to fund a foundation in her mother's name, but no amount of money could restore what had been taken, and no amount of vigilance could prevent her from wondering in her darkest moments whether she might have saved her mother if she had only been paying closer attention. Now, watching the footage of Darius standing before that portrait, Victoria felt her pulse quicken. He stood perfectly still for nearly 2 minutes. His hands remained at his sides. His expression was partially obscured by the camera angle, but there was something in his posture that suggested reverence rather than curiosity. Then he spoke. The words were too quiet for the microphone to capture clearly, just a murmur that the audio system rendered as static and breath. He had not known anyone was watching. He had not known the cameras could see him there. And yet he had stopped his work, walked to a part of the house that was not on his assigned route, and stood before a portrait of a woman he had never met. Victoria watched the footage 3 more times before she allowed herself to admit what she was feeling. This was no longer professional vigilance. This was obsession. She upgraded the camera in the East Wing corridor the following morning. Over the next 2 weeks, Victoria's surveillance operation expanded beyond anything she had originally intended. She installed higher resolution cameras in every room Darius might enter. She upgraded the microphone sensitivity until she could hear his footsteps from 3 rooms away. She configured motion alerts to notify her phone whenever he deviated from his assigned areas. Sleep became something that happened in fragments between footage reviews. She would doze for an hour or two, then wake with a start, and immediately check the monitors to see what she had missed. Her housekeeper began leaving concerned notes about the untouched meals in the kitchen. Her assistant sent emails asking if she needed anything, if she was feeling well, if there was something wrong. Victoria ignored them all. The data was too important. She compiled a file on Darius Mitchell that grew thicker with each passing night. His movements cataloged to the minute, his habits analyzed for patterns, his expressions captured and studied for any sign of deception. She learned that he always checked his watch at 3:15 and that his pace increased measurably in the hour that followed. She learned that he avoided the staff break room when others were present, preferring to take his meals alone. She learned that he spoke to no one unless spoken to first, and even then his responses were brief and courteous and entirely unrevealing. And she learned that every single night, without exception, he found his way to the East Wing corridor and stood before her mother's portrait. The visits lasted between 90 seconds and 4 minutes. He never touched the frame. He never spoke loudly enough for the enhanced microphones to capture his words. He simply stood there in the darkness, a gray figure before a painted face, engaged in some private communion that Victoria could observe but not understand. She tried analyzing his lip movements to determine what he was saying. The footage was too grainy, the angle too oblique. She considered installing a camera directly facing the portrait, but something stopped her. Perhaps the knowledge that such a camera would be visible, and visibility would change his behavior. Perhaps something else she was not ready to name. The truth was that Victoria had spent $300,000 on surveillance upgrades and countless hours of her life watching this man, and she was no closer to understanding him than she had been on his first night. Worse, the watching had begun to cost her. She caught herself wondering what Darius would think if he knew. Would he be afraid? Angry? Would he simply continue his work with the same unflappable discipline he brought to everything else? The not knowing was unbearable, and for the first time since she had installed the first camera in this house, Victoria began to question whether surveillance was giving her safety or taking it away. On the 23rd night of his employment, Victoria decided to confront Darius directly. She found him in the kitchen at 1 o'clock in the morning, polishing the stainless steel surfaces of the industrial refrigerator. He looked up when she entered, and for a moment something flickered across his face, an emotion too brief to identify before his expression settled into polite neutrality. The kitchen was vast and cold, designed for a catering staff that Victoria rarely employed. Her footsteps echoed against the tile as she approached, and she was suddenly aware of how strange this must appear. The billionaire owner, descending from her quarters in the small hours of the morning to speak with the night janitor. She had prepared questions, careful questions, designed to probe his background without revealing the extent of her surveillance. But standing before him now, watching him set down his cleaning cloth and give her his full attention, she found that all her preparation had abandoned her. He waited, patient and still, like a man who had learned that silence was often the safest response. She asked how he was finding the work. "Fine," he said. The house was well maintained. His duties were clear. She asked if he had any concerns about the night shift, the hours, the isolation. No, he said he preferred working when the house was quiet. She asked about his background, where he had worked before. What had brought him to this kind of employment? He answered simply and without elaboration. He had worked in maintenance for years, different buildings, different clients. He liked the work because it was honest. You could see when something was clean and when it was not. There was no defensiveness in his responses, no attempt to justify or explain or ingratiate. He answered her questions as though they were entirely reasonable and required nothing more than factual replies. And yet, Victoria felt more unsettled than she had watching him through the cameras, because the cameras allowed distance. The cameras allowed analysis. Here, standing 3 feet away from Darius Mitchell, she had no distance at all. She could see the gray at his temples and the lines around his eyes. She could see the calluses on his hands and the careful way he held himself, as though he was always ready to step back, to yield space, to make himself smaller if necessary. For a brief moment, she registered the quiet pressure of what it meant for a black man to move through spaces like this, and then she pushed the thought away because she did not know him well enough to name it. He asked if there was anything else she needed. She said no. She thanked him for his time. She turned and walked back to the stairs, feeling his gaze on her back until she was out of sight. In her study, she pulled up the footage of their conversation and watched it 3 times. His body language revealed nothing she had not already seen. His tone carried no hidden frequencies. He was exactly what he appeared to be, a man doing his job, nothing more. And somehow that was the most disturbing possibility of all. 12 days after their kitchen conversation, the temperature in Greenwich dropped to 7 degrees below zero. Victoria woke at 4 a.m. to an alert on her phone. Motion detected in the garage. She pulled up the feed and saw Darius moving quickly between vehicles, his breath visible in the frigid air. Something was wrong. She switched to the exterior cameras and saw it immediately. One of the pipes running along the outside wall of the guest house had burst, sending water streaming across the frozen ground. In this temperature, the water would freeze within minutes, creating a hazard that could damage the foundation, the walkways, the entire drainage system of the lower grounds. The proper response was to call the emergency maintenance service. Victoria had them on retainer for exactly this kind of situation, but as she reached for her phone, she saw Darius emerge from the garage, carrying tools, not his tools. These were from the maintenance supply room, which he should not have had access to. The door required a code that was given only to senior household staff. Victoria watched as Darius made his way to the burst pipe. He was not wearing a coat, only the gray uniform that offered no protection against the brutal cold. His hands were bare as he assessed the damage, touching the metal pipe despite the temperature that must have burned his skin. He worked for 47 minutes. Victoria watched every second of it. He shut off the water supply using the emergency valve, something that required knowing where the valve was located and how to operate it in freezing conditions. He applied a temporary seal to the rupture using materials from the maintenance kit. He cleared the accumulated ice from the walkway using a combination of salt and physical labor that left him visibly exhausted. When he finished, he returned the tools to exactly where he had found them. He cleaned the floor of the garage where he had tracked in snow. He resumed his normal duties as though nothing had happened. He did not file a report. He did not leave a note for the morning staff. He did not mention it to anyone. The only reason Victoria knew what he had done was because she had been watching. She pulled up the audio from the exterior microphones, enhanced to capture even faint sounds in the quiet of the night. Most of the recording was wind and the crack of ice and the mechanical sounds of Darius's work. But at the very end, as he stood looking at the repaired pipe, she heard him speak. Just a few words, so quiet that the microphone almost missed them entirely. "There are things that have to be done right," he said, "even when no one knows." He was not speaking to anyone. He did not know anyone was listening. Victoria sat in the darkness of her study and listened to those words over and over until the sun began to rise. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday night, 3 weeks after the pipe incident. Victoria had spent those weeks in a state of mounting tension that she could neither explain nor escape. She continued to watch Darius through the cameras, but the watching had changed. She was no longer searching for evidence of wrongdoing. She was searching for something else entirely, an answer to a question she had not yet learned how to ask. She found him in the East Wing corridor at 3:40 in the morning, standing before her mother's portrait as he did every night. But this time, instead of watching from her study, she walked down the stairs and through the darkened halls until she stood behind him. He heard her approach and turned in the dim light of the corridor. His face was difficult to read, but he did not seem surprised. He did not seem afraid. He seemed, if anything, relieved, as though he had been waiting for this moment and was grateful it had finally arrived. She asked him why, not why he was standing here in a part of the house where he had no business being, but why he came every night, why he spoke to a portrait of a woman he had never met, why he did any of the things she had observed him doing over the past 2 months. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Victoria began to wonder if he would answer at all. Then he told her 8 years ago he said his wife had been sick, cancer that started in her lungs and spread everywhere before the doctors could stop it. She had been in the hospital for 3 months. And during those 3 months, a nurse had taken care of her with a kindness that went beyond professional duty. The nurse had stayed late when his wife was afraid, had held her hand when the pain was too much, had talked to her about ordinary things, recipes and weather, and the small comedies of daily life. When his wife needed to remember that the world existed beyond the walls of that room, his wife died anyway. There was nothing anyone could have done. But because of that nurse, she did not die alone. She did not die afraid. She died knowing that someone, a stranger who owed her nothing, had chosen to be present in her final hours. He had tried to find the nurse afterward to thank her, to tell her what her kindness had meant. But she had transferred to another hospital, and his attempts to track her down had led nowhere until 6 months ago when he saw a photograph in a newspaper, a foundation event honoring healthcare workers who went above and beyond. And there in the background of the photograph, he recognized her face. The photograph caption mentioned the foundation's founder, Victoria Ashford. He took the job not knowing what he would find, not planning anything, just wanting to be close to something connected to the woman who had made his wife's death bearable. The portrait, he said, reminded him of his wife's nurse. The same kindness in the eyes, the same sense that here was a person who had understood something important about what it meant to take care of others. He did not ask Victoria for anything. He did not explain why he had kept this secret for 2 months. He simply stood there in the corridor, having finally spoken the truth, and waited to learn what would happen next. Victoria heard herself ask the question that had been building inside her since the night she first watched him through the cameras. "Have you seen enough to trust me?" she asked, and Darius Mitchell, night janitor, widower, father, looked at her with an expression that contained no calculation and no defense. "Have you seen enough to trust me?" he asked in return. The answer, Victoria realized, was yes. She had watched him through 47 cameras for 63 nights. She had analyzed his every movement, cataloged his every habit, searched for any sign of deception or hidden motive. And what she had found was not a threat. What she had found was a man who did the right thing when no one was watching, who honored a debt of gratitude 8 years after it was incurred, who spoke to a portrait of a stranger's mother because she reminded him of someone who had shown kindness to his dying wife. The cameras had shown her everything, but they had not taught her to trust. That was something she had to choose for herself. Over the following month, Victoria began dismantling the surveillance system she had spent years constructing. It did not happen all at once. Trust, she was learning, was not a switch that could be flipped, but a muscle that had to be rebuilt through use. She started with the cameras in the staff areas, the break room, and the service corridors, and the spaces where the people who worked in her house deserved privacy. Then she removed the enhanced audio equipment that let her hear whispered conversations from 3 rooms away. Then the motion sensors that tracked every footstep across her marble floors. Each removal felt like losing a limb. She had lived so long with total information that the absence of it created a kind of vertigo. She would wake in the night and reach for her phone to check the monitors, only to remember that the monitors no longer showed what they once had. But alongside the vertigo came something else, something that took her weeks to identify because she had not felt it in so long. Relief. The weights of watching was heavier than she had realized. The constant vigilance, the endless analysis, the assumption that every person in her life was hiding something that would eventually hurt her. She had built her fortress of cameras because she believed it would keep her safe, but what it had actually done was keep her alone. Darius continued his night shift through all of this. Victoria no longer watched him through screens, but she began to encounter him in person more frequently. Brief conversations in the hallway, A shared cup of coffee in the kitchen at 2 in the morning, moments of ordinary human contact that required no surveillance to verify. She learned that his daughter Amara was struggling in school, not academically, but socially. The other children knew her father worked as a janitor, and 9-year-olds could be cruel about such things. She learned that Darius had once been an accountant before his wife's illness drained their savings, and his grief made it impossible to return to a desk job where he would have to pretend everything was fine. She learned that he had taken the night shift specifically because it allowed him to be home when Amara woke up, to make her breakfast, to walk her to school, to be present in the hours when presence mattered most. In exchange, she told him about her mother, about the hospital and the lawsuit, and the foundation she had built to honor Margaret's memory, about the guilt she carried for not being there when her mother needed her most, about the cameras that were supposed to prevent that kind of loss from ever happening again. Darius listened the way he did everything else, with full attention and without judgment. And when she finished, he said something that she would remember for the rest of her life. "You cannot watch your way to safety," he said. "You can only live your way there." 3 months after their confrontation in the East Wing corridor, Victoria offered Darius a new position. Not janitor, not maintenance supervisor, something she invented specifically for him. A role that had no precedent in her household because it was based on something her household had never had before. She called it Director of Household Well-Being. The title was deliberately vague because the job was deliberately broad. His responsibility would be to ensure that everyone who worked in her house, from the chef to the gardeners to the security staff, was treated with dignity and supported in their lives beyond their employment. It was in essence a job built on trust. Trust that he would know what people needed without surveillance to tell him. Trust that he would act with integrity when no one was checking his work. Trust that the kindness he had shown to a portrait of a stranger's mother would extend to every person who walked through her doors. Darius accepted. Not immediately, but after a week of consideration, during which Victoria did not once check the cameras to see what he was doing. His first official act was to establish a fund for employees' children covering educational expenses and extracurricular activities. His second was to create a policy ensuring that no one who worked for Victoria would ever have to choose between their job and a family emergency. His third was to remove the final camera from the East Wing corridor, the one that had watched him stand before Margaret Ashford's portrait night after night. Victoria was present when he took it down. She watched him place it in a box with the others, dozens of devices that had once been her eyes and ears and the foundation of her sense of security. "Do you regret it?" he asked, "giving this up?" She considered the question. The honest answer was complicated. Part of her would always want the certainty that cameras provided, the ability to know, to verify, to never be surprised by human behavior. But another part of her, a part that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten it existed, understood that certainty was not the same as safety, that watching was not the same as seeing, that the only way to truly know another person was to take the risk of trusting them. "No," she said, "I do not regret it." And for the first time in more years than she could count, Victoria Ashford meant exactly what she said. The house was quieter now, not silent, but peaceful in a way that constant surveillance had never allowed. Victoria could walk through her own corridors without wondering who was watching the footage of her passing. She could sit in her study without the glow of monitors reflecting in the windows. She could simply live. Darius brought Amara to the estate on weekends sometimes. The girl was shy at first, uncertain how to behave in a house that was larger than her entire apartment building. But Victoria had a gift for children, a patience she had never had the opportunity to exercise. And slowly, Amara began to open up. They would walk through the gardens together, Victoria pointing out the flowers her mother had loved. Amara asking questions about butterflies and birds, and why some leaves changed color while others stayed green. Simple questions with simple answers. The kind of conversation that required no analysis, no suspicion, no search for hidden meanings. One afternoon, Amara asked why there were no cameras in the garden. Victoria knelt down to meet the girl's eyes. because some things, she said, are too beautiful to watch through a screen. Amara considered this with the seriousness that children bring to new ideas. Then she nodded, apparently satisfied, and ran off to chase a butterfly through the roses. Victoria watched her go. Not through a camera, not through a monitor, just with her own eyes in her own garden, in a house that had finally become a home. That night, she stood in the East Wing corridor where she had confronted Darius 3 months before. The portrait of her mother looked down at her with the same kind eyes that had always seemed to see more than they revealed. "I think you would have liked him," Victoria said. "I think you would have understood." She did not know if her mother could hear her. She did not know if the words mattered to anyone but herself. But she said them anyway because there are some things that have to be said, even when no one is listening, especially when no one is listening. She turned off the light and walked back to her room through the darkened hallway. Tomorrow there would be meetings and decisions and the ordinary business of managing a life that was larger than one person could reasonably handle. But tonight there was only this: a house without cameras, a trust without evidence. A woman who had finally learned that the things most worth seeing cannot be captured on any screen. She slept well for the first time